Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson, and today I'm interviewing Bill Bridges, a name that should be familiar to Mage fans. He has made significant contributions to every edition of Mage the Ascension. He has written, developed, supported, and done many other things for the game we love. I wouldn't be surprised if he talked writers off of ledges, but only to meet deadlines. How are you doing today?
I'm all right. How are you? Thanks for that intro.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to have a chance to talk to you. Well, Bill Bridges has taken time out of his schedule to sit down with me today and discuss Mage, his time at White Wolf, and the role playing hobby. As a host for this podcast, I have a responsibility to the listeners to facilitate an intelligent conversation and relay the questions they've submitted. But I'm tossing that out the window. As a longtime fan of Mr. Bridges' work, I am going to ask the questions that have been on my mind for years. I'm sorry, folks, but that's the danger of asking a fan to play host. Mr. Bridges, you've heard this question before, but how did you get started in the role-playing hobby?
Well, in high school, way back late '70s, some people were playing D&D, and I wondered what this thing was. So I just kind of sucked into that, and so yeah, D&D was the big thing for a while. Monster Manual was my first gaming book. But then we quickly spread out into all sorts of other games. We were trying everything that we could get our hands on. And for a good long while, say Champions was our big one, RuneQuest for me too, all the stuff that Greg Stafford was doing at Chaosium. So yeah, we were just into all that stuff. And then when I was in college, I met some real hardcore gamers. I went to Virginia Commonwealth University, or VCU for short, and there was an student organization called the Game Masters, and we just gamed all the time. That was practically our major in college, really, was gaming. And so many of those guys were going on into the industry, getting stuff published and working full time at some companies. And so I tried my hand at writing something and got it published in a Pendragon supplement for Chaosium. And that came out at Origins in 1991, which was the same convention that Vampire premiered at. And that's where I ran into Andrew Greenberg, who I had known but hadn't seen for a little while. And here he was pushing this Vampire game he just worked on with White Wolf. And he needed writers, so I immediately started writing for Vampire the Masquerade. And then when they needed a werewolf developer, they brought me in full time for that, and working on all the other White Wolf stuff ever since throughout the years.
So the right place at the right time, although it does help to be the right guy. Well, that's
Yeah,
great.
it helps to have already written something and published it. So the very first one I had luckily came out right at that time. And also, I knew Andrew. His brother Dan had started the VCU Game Masters, and so we were all just, I would game with him occasionally. He wasn't living in Richmond with us at the time, but so having a wide network of gamers and stuff who are deep enough into this stuff who go into the industry helps a lot also.
Definitely. Well, when you were with White Wolf, how would you describe your job? Did you choose your writing projects? Were you the developer who worked where one was needed? I was hoping I could just kind of get a
The way it
sense of
worked at
that.
White Wolf is you would have a line developer for each of the lines. So Vampire was Andrew Greenberg initially, then when he left, others took over. Werewolf was me initially, and the idea was you'd have to put out, gosh, how many books were we doing a year then? 9, I think, for each line. And so it was your job as developer to conceive of what the books would be, outline them, and then go hire writers to write them. And usually you wind up writing a lot of it yourself also, just in the margins or when you can't get a writer in time. It's a very deadline-driven industry, and a lot of times when someone couldn't do it, you scrabble to get someone else to write it, and then if they can't, you're doing it at the last minute. So it's so intermixed. It's hard to go back in those books and say what was this pure writer's work over here versus what little bits I may have added or what I wrote and so on. But each developer had his own lines there, and we would all talk all the time, so we were certainly trading ideas back and forth across lines. But really, the actual labor and the work was each developer's responsibility. So, Phil came in to take over, Mage early on, and so he did all the Mage books and so on with each of those lines, having an individual developer.
Okay, well, that gives me a much better idea. You spent more time with Werewolf and Mage than the other World of Darkness games. Was that because of preference, or was there another reason?
They were certainly the ones I'm most interested in, yeah. I mean, first of all, Werewolf, I just love the darn game. A game of my soul in many ways. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly liked Vampire, I certainly liked writing for it, but Werewolf was definitely much more down my lane, and so was Mage when that came out, too. I did some initial brainstorming work early on in Wraith. Also, didn't do a lot on Changeling. I did write for Changeling later, but didn't do a lot in the development of it. But definitely the ones I had the most hand in on during their creation was Werewolf and Mage.
A distinguished lineage, to be certain. And I'm probably just saying that because those are the two games out of the original five that I enjoyed so much. But excellent work there. What was it particularly that attracted you to the Werewolf game? When compared to all these other great games, there was something about Werewolf that really got your attention.
Well, yeah, I back in the '80s gotten really big into shamanism, studying folklore, mythology, and especially shamanism. And there was this whole movement called neo shamanism, but people kind of trying to get into little trances themselves. Michael Harner was a anthropologist who had created this sort of system of drumming where you could kind of get into your little mini trance. It's really very similar to what Carl Jung, the psychologist, called active imagination. And that was another thing I was heavily into was Jungian psychology and stuff. And so the merger of Jungian psychology and shamanism studies and mythology, it just worked so well for Werewolf. And, I was also interested in ecology at the time. I was reading up what Earth First was up to in the '80s. They were a very radical ecological organization that, unlike Greenpeace, which was largely working through the political means, their idea was direct action. So, they were doing what was called monkey wrenching, and some people called it eco-terrorism. I preferred Edward Abbey's definition of eco-sabotage. Sabotage wasn't where you hurt people, it was where you hurt machines. So that's where you get people putting Caro syrup down the gas tanks of bulldozers so they couldn't take down trees, that kind of stuff. And I wasn't doing any of that myself, but I was kind of cheering on from the sidelines what a lot of these people were doing back then. So that definitely came right into the Werewolf game.
Yeah, yeah, that certainly does play into the themes I remember with the first two editions of Werewolf.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most misunderstood thing about Werewolf, the
Ooh,
game?
misunderstood. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Someone would have to give me a particular example, and I can tell them whether I think
Well,
that's
I,
right
I
or
guess
wrong.
what I was thinking when I wrote down the question was, in my experience as a World of Darkness fan, go to a lot of places online. There's sort of an ongoing discussion between vampire fans saying, hey, this game has definite themes. It was written to emphasize, a certain kind of game. And there's all these people who are doing it wrong. And these other people are saying, no, there's no wrong way to do it. We're having plenty of fun over here. And is there a similar kind of discussion with Werewolf? It's like, it's not about fistfights and car chases. It should be doing this or doing that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my opinion of Werewolf is it's very broad. You can run it in any sort of ways. I do think a lot of people may overlook some of that shamanic animist spirit side to it. It's there, but it becomes maybe in some eyes a little too utilitarian as opposed to the more spiritual sense that the werewolves themselves have of it. And so some people could look at especially the art in Werewolf and really kind of think it's really just a game about berserkers. And you can play it that way, but I really tried to make sure there was a broad enough thing where it's not just about fighting. It's the fighting is what the fun part. When you get really angry, you get to take it out on Pentex and stuff. But there's a spiritual core to it. There's an ecological core. There's some metaphysical philosophy there too. Maybe some people don't get deep enough on that level. I don't know.
But it's nice to give them the option if that's what they'd like to do. I
Right.
understand that. That speaks well to me. So what kind of material were you most trying to bring to the game after it first came out and supplements were coming out? What kind of things did you want to put in there for the customers?
Pretty much just the panoply of whatever we could dream up at the time, really, whatever made sense from writers and what I was thinking of. Werewolf was one of those games where I had to hit the ground running when Mark had done some initial work in hiring some writers to get some supplements going, and then I came in and found out he hadn't finished it, and some people weren't writing who we thought were and stuff, and so I had to hire a lot of people, some friends of mine, some other people who've been working for a while in the industry to do some very quick work, and some of that can be fun, some of it can be frustrating. There is a phrase I believe the editors or somebody had come up with concerning. This is in the UK comics. There was a 2000 AD was a famous long-running comics magazine, and they wrote this stuff really quick and put it out really quick. And one of the terms they came up with for that kind of speed at which you're writing, which you can't turn your eternal censor on at that point. Just whatever comes out, because you got to make the deadline. And the term they use is thrill power, because you just get a lot of energy out of it. Then later on, you might look, ooh, I wish we'd done something different. But there it is. It's out there on the page. And some of that initial werewolf stuff was that, because the deadline was looming, no one had been hired, so I was getting people left and right to write little bits and stuff. Book of the Worm was a big giant anthology book where I'd say, here, quick, you give me 5,000 words, you give me 10, you give me 3, whatever, however you could fit into it. A bunch of different people crammed onto that book. And it comes out as just this chaotic panoply of stuff about the worm, but I think that was perfect for the actual subject matter. So some of these things kind of just worked the right way. It was almost like kismet in some ways.
I would probably second that opinion because I remember some of the earlier World of Darkness books, and there were all these cool ideas in there. And it's like when you stop and think, it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily fit perfectly with everything else, but darn it, I just like it so much. I don't care.
Yeah, exactly. You just throw whatever you can. And ultimately, people are going to run it however they run it in their own games anyway. So having a giant, perfectly coherent presentation, that would get a little too static. The best idea, I think, is to have a bunch of different stuff out there and let people pick and choose how they're going to emphasize it in their own games. I mean,
Well,
there's a lot of people, for instance, one of the things that bothers me about post first edition and second edition Vampire is it kind of lost the Golconda quest. In the first and second edition, there was that whole idea that, we may be able to get ourselves out of this curse through this mysterious thing called Golconda. It could be a lie. It could have just been bullshit. But the fact that some people pursued it gave an angle to that game, even if you hardly ever touched it. I thought was interesting. And it really kind of disappeared third edition onward. It was there, but there wasn't much to it, I think, and I thought that was a bit of a mistake. And I tried in Werewolf to not lose those sort of angles of a more spiritual answer to this stuff, because it is a dark world, the whole gothic punk thing. Our world only darker, but you got to have a flashlight there at least at times to make it where it's not just complete nihilism.
yeah, thanks for telling me that because I had read the vampire books through the first two editions, and once it got to revised edition, I was older and I was a busy guy and I couldn't keep up with it as much. But if I remember correctly, for the 5 flagship World of Darkness games, each one had some kind of, I guess you could say, transcendental goal that that sort of supernatural creature would talk about. Maybe it's a rumor, maybe it's real, but at least the idea is there. And of course, for Mage, it's in the title of the game, so
Yeah,
maybe that
exactly.
changed things a bit. But I remember Golconda for Vampire, and each game had its elements. So yeah,
Mhm.
it's unfortunate to hear that got less emphasis as the years rolled by. But if we can turn to Mage the Ascension for a moment. What did you contribute to the first edition rulebook? Now, you said you contributed the Zigragler, the aliens that came out of another dimension, but you must have contributed other things.
It was largely the technocracy. The idea was that Stewart turned in Mage. Here it is, boom, and it was really late, and we all looked at it and said, "This is a great metaphysical game, but where's the actual game?" The technocracy was just a faceless enemy. There wasn't any real cues on, well, how do I use these as NPCs? How do I run them? And there was really no hard magic system. So basically, a lot of us broke up into individual groups to tackle these things that had to be in that book. So, for instance, Andrew Greenberg and Travis Williams started working on the magic system. They came up with a sphere system in a really short amount of time. Whereas I and Rob Hatch went off and brainstormed, okay, what is the technocracy? And that's where we came up with the different, branches, the different conventions, the New World Order, the Syndicate, Void Engineers, etc., etc. Those didn't exist before then. The idea is we have to put a face on this abstract enemy.
Oh, I'm so glad I hijacked this interview. That's the kind of thing I wanted to hear about. That is fascinating. Okay, so you had a lot of contributions there for the early technocracy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of us did in the office. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, I was kind of guiding that with Rob Hatch, but we would have meetings where we'd all brainstorm this kind of stuff and so
Oh,
on.
so
So,
not just you, but still,
right.
I mean, you were one of the guys in the room. So
Yeah.
that's just fascinating for me because yeah, the technocracy in the early editions was so cool for me, and I brought it into my games. Had a lot of fun sessions with my players. But let's move on here. This isn't about me. Your work on the first Sons of Ether tradition book impressed me. It impressed a lot of other people that I talked to online. Does that project stand out in your memory?
Yeah, I loved it. They were my favorite part of Mage at the time. Because, yeah, I was hugely into pulp stuff at the time. Some people may recognize in Doc Eon, that's Doc Savage and his, five companions, except cut down to three for Doc Eon, his terrific trio. He was the sort of son of ether in the fiction at the start. But the whole rest of it draws on, sci-fi and pulp stuff from Jules Verne to H.G. Wells and all sorts of that other stuff. And, the crazy, I think you used pseudoscience earlier, kind of side of things like the hollow earth and the ideas that that's really there and strange, just weird science, let's just say. Love it all.
Awesome. Yeah, I love to hear that. Back when I read it, I didn't know anything about the pulp stories, and I didn't see Doc Savage and Doc Eon. But a few years later, someone else got me into the pulp stories, and then I started connecting the dots, and I was like, I only admired the book more after that. I saw the first Sons of Ether book as an insightful illustration of several concepts in Mage, like consensus, paradox, blurring the line between vulgar and coincidental magic. I still recommend it to Mage fans who haven't read it. Do you think there are concepts in Mage that faded into the background with later editions?
Yes and no. I mean, again, Mage is such a broad canvas that you can't tackle it all the time. So it made sense that certain editions were going to, pay attention to some things more than others, certain concepts more than others. And so, I mean, nothing particularly occurs to me. I mean, the idea of the consensus was always in there, but with the Sons of Ether, that was their whole thing was, how can you introduce wonder to everybody so that it becomes natural law rather than magic? So it's one thing to be doing magic on the margins, but boy, it'd be great if we all had flying cars. They're only going to get them, and everybody believes in flying cars, and so on. And so that was their shtick. Whereas the technocracy is no, let's carefully control that consensus, and so that people can only believe in what we specifically want. And I think some of that, again, up and down some mages, yeah, most of the other traditions didn't seem to care for any of that kind of stuff particularly. That wasn't a big thing. Yes, they all want everybody to believe what they believe, but there's a little bit of a more of a elitist strain there, I guess. And the Etherites are just as elitist, but they fool themselves into thinking that they're there for the common man. As long as the common man, buys into my magnetic ray rather than that electrodes, done over there.
So initially, when I was reading the first Sons of Ether tradition book, Doc Eon was just another character. But years later, I took an interest in pulp fiction, started reading the Doc Savage stories, and I was just amazed at how appropriate the selection was that you made. Because when I was reading the first five Doc Savage novels, they were written in the early 30s, there were a number of scenes where the Doc Savage character and even the narrator is trying to explain to the reader that this amazing thing that Doc Savage did, it's not really that amazing, you see. It's quite plausible because he trained in this and he had this object up his sleeve and he's practiced it so many times. And so you really shouldn't be amazed that he's walking up the side of a building or, exploding something with the power of his mind or, et cetera, on and on. And so I was reading this and I was thinking, this is just like reading the early Mage books in first edition, only this was written 60 years before. So it's like to be able to pick up on those novels and say, this sounds like Mage. I'm using this one. I mean, that was just so perfect. It amazed me. But one thing I have never been able to understand was the Tsar Vargo character in the book, another just amazing character. At first, you think he's a villain, and then you start thinking, wait a minute, it's not that simple. But was this just pure invention, or was this based on some pulp stories? Because I remember some pulp stories about like a Zeppelin emperor, but then I went to research it and I just was not finding it. So I don't
Czar
know.
Vargo was a homage to Jules Verne's mixture of two characters, his Captain Nemo and his Captain Robur, the master of the air, and he had flying machines. He's not as well known as Nemo through 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but it's that idea of a scientific genius who's taking on the rest of the world from a amazing contraption he's built for himself, either a flying machine as in Robur or a submarine in Nemo. And so yeah, he's just an homage to that Jules Verne style hero who is going to stand against the nations of the world to force them to do what he wants.
I get it. Creativity is hiding your sources.
Yeah,
That was
I said
clever.
I didn't think they were hidden. I remember Phil didn't. I was like, "What's this?" But I remember Kathy, one of the editors, go, "Oh, that's Jules Verne." I was like, "Yeah, there you go."
I need to read more Jules Verne clearly because that was just an amazing addition to the book. But let's move on and take a look at Revised Edition. You took over as developer of Mage Revised Edition after just Heinig. Heinig expressed his vision for the game in the book The Bitter Road. After I read Manifesto Transmission from the Rogue Council, I got the impression that was your chance to give some direction to Revised Edition, to give it your own touch. Can you remember what you wanted to accomplish with that book?
Really, the idea was just to put a big mystery in there, something that everybody was scratching their head over and trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. And plus, to have a sense that there was something bigger going on despite the Avatar storm, which Jess has talked about before too, which was a very unfortunate idea for Mage. And it came down to a lot of the managers at White Wolf felt that Mage was getting way too cosmic and weird and wanted to bring it down more street level. But they kind of came up with this edict of the Avatar Storm, and that wasn't the best idea. There were all sorts of other ways you could have brought Mage down to street level. Unfortunately, that was their method, and Jess got stuck with it, even though he didn't want it. And then I came in and said, okay, how are we going to work with this? Because we couldn't do another edition of Mage. It was still too soon. So it was really just trying to work around that. You've got a more street level world, but it's Mage. It needs to be mysterious. It can't just be, a bunch of solipsists, fighting each other for their own, realities. That's part of it, but they themselves have to be wondering, wait a minute, what's really going on here? And so the hope was to have that, and it never really got to any kind of fruition because we wound up wrapping up the World of Darkness and moving on to doing what's now called Chronicles of Darkness or New World of Darkness, Made the Awakening. But so it never fully came to any kind of fruition point, but it was there to kind of start getting some speculation back into the game, some sort of plot line there, what's going on behind the scenes.
I remember when I was rereading the book recently for the podcast, this opens up the possibility that maybe oracles are up to something, and their magic is so high above ours that we can't catch every detail. But boy, we're suspicious. I thought that is so cool. I just love bringing that in. So yeah, definitely thumbs up on that one. And I didn't know that Heinig was given the directive to put in the Avatar Storm. I had always assumed that was perhaps one of his ideas, but it's so interesting to hear the origin of that. Because yeah, I was a Mage fan. I started with the first book when it came out, and I was a big fan. And when the Avatar Storm came, I thought, well, this isn't my idea of a good time. I don't know
Yeah,
about
it,
this.
it was a clunky way to basically get what they wanted, which was a street level Mage, which is fine, but there were so many other better ways they could have done. What they didn't do is what we did in the old days, which was let's get everybody together in a room and brainstorm a lot of stuff. Instead, it was just some of the managers saying, "Here, do this." That doesn't work.
I see. I see. Well, a similar question. What did you try to accomplish with your time as a developer of Revised Edition? What I see is Infinite Tapestry opened up the Umbra again, Forged by Dragon's Fire, revised rules on creating wonders. But were there other things you wanted to do with Revised Edition?
Well, some of it had already been set in motion by Jess. He had hired out a number of books, and so it was a matter of taking those to fruition. The Forged by Dragonfire, I wanted to bring in a bit more of that element of, in most, wizardry in a sense. There's a lot of accoutrement and equipment and stuff throughout stories. And that's something that's never been a big thing for Mage except for Technomancers. And I just wanted to have a book where, here's some cool stuff to actually, use in the game.
Yeah, I remember Clark Ashton Smith's pulp stories. He wrote a couple about powerful wizards that everyone was afraid of. And as you read the story, whenever the wizard is going to use magic, he would pick up an object and use the object on them. It's like, huh, I think I see a pattern here.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. It's in certain other fantasy. Obviously, Mage is different, it's more internal, but it's fun to have that stuff there anyway. And Mage hadn't fully done a book about that kind of stuff yet. There was also the Fallen Tower Las Vegas because Mage hadn't had a setting book in a long while that I remembered. I mean, some of that stuff would creep in around the edges, but except for Chantries, I don't recall there being another one at the moment. There may have been, but the idea was let's go and do a setting book again to show everybody an example of a city where mages are, what they look like in this particular city.
Okay.
Because some of the other games had so many setting books. Mage had very few of them.
Yeah, I do remember there were a lot more setting books for Vampire than there were for Mage, and so it was really great that you had that chance to do it. And what better city than Las Vegas? That was an interesting place. It's where you don't expect mages to be hanging out, that you can find a lot of interesting things for them to do.
Yeah, good stuff.
Now, in Ascension, planned as the final book for Mage Revised Edition, didn't actually end up being that, but when it was in the planning stages, that was its job. On page 19, you gave an open letter to the fans, sharing your thoughts on the game. You wrote, there were some odd ideas that slipped into the first edition that were later quietly ignored, many for good reasons. Others just didn't fit the direction in which the game was now going. You also mentioned some of the frankly over-the-top directions the game had occasionally wandered into. Can you tell us, if you're able to remember, what you saw as the direction the game was going in, and how is that different from the old direction?
Well, I don't remember writing the forward too much, but what I was probably referring to over the life of Mage, very early on, it was kind of a weird, wild game, and that's typified by the illustration for the original Storyteller screen in first edition, which had these guys on these flying ships shooting lasers at each other and ninjas, and what the heck is that? And that is what we kind of moved away from as soon as we could. But again, that was another reason they introduced the Avatar Storm, is to try to get away from that wild and woolly, deep Umbra sort of stuff and the high Umbra, which I like, but maybe seemed to be a little too hard for anybody to actually have any kind of the real world didn't mean as much anymore as if you're spending too much time way out in the wilds of the Umbra. That's what the thrust of it was, to move away from that.
Okay, so the high Umbra, the deep Umbra, nice to have in the game, but you wanted to be sure that the people buying the books didn't get the impression that was where they were supposed to put their games. That was
Yeah,
just an option.
it was moving away from the our world only darker to where another world only darker. And we want it, and the whole point of the World of Darkness is it is our world. That's the core of it. And the farther you move in, and Werewolf had the same problem, admittedly, and Wraith too, where it just ran off into the fantasy lands, which are great, but the core of the game is here and now, just sideways.
Okay.
And
Do you think
maybe
stuff like Deep Umbra, etc., do you think it made the game less approachable for new people? Was that a concern?
Yeah, I think that may have been part of the problem. Is it just didn't seem like, well, what mages in the modern world anymore? Is, well, they're not in the modern world; they're in other worlds, And again, fun stuff, but it should be more of a higher level kind of thing or an occasional thing. And it became too much of a thing of mages off in these chantries, off in these other worlds, doing their things, and not enough the kind of street level again stuff.
Okay. Yeah, that's been a question in the back of my mind for a long time. Early, I mean, very early in first edition, there was a book of chantries,
Yeah.
and we never saw another one. I mean, there was one for Sorcerer's Crusade, historical spin-off game, but I mean, for the three editions of Mage that followed, we never saw a book of chantries again. So I guess it was because you were concerned that players would spend all of their time in a cool castle instead of the modern world.
Yeah, part of that was that book had been written largely before Phil came in as developer. Stu had hired him, and then a lot of the stuff that was in there represented that weirder version of Mage, which it had gone a little too far too soon. It would have been great to build up to that sort of thing, but it started out of the gate, and nobody really wanted. The idea was, well, what's going on in this world? And that's where I think Phil put most of his initial emphasis.
Okay.
So,
And as developer, you were also helping to keep things pointed on the real world.
well, yeah, when I came in as in the revised, it was already in that because the Avatar Storm cut out a lot of that kind of stuff. So it was really just making sure, well, what do we do with this game in the real world now? And to where it's not just about these super uber powerful mages off in chantries doing stuff. They're there. Again, that was part of a large thing about the Rogue Council. What are they? Are they oracles out there, pulling strings or what? But we don't
Okay.
see them. They're more mysterious at that point, as opposed to, oh, here it is on page 73 in the Book of Chantries. Here's what they're up to.
So after coming back to help with the Mage 20 core rulebook, what did you think of Mage 20?
Mage 20 was great. That's a big giant masterwork on that one. Phil did an incredible job of pulling it all together. Again, just shows how the breadth of Mage, for it to be that big, and it had to be, to cover it all. It was amazing stuff.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I wanted to kind of break for a minute and ask kind of an industry question. I see RPG books as having kind of two jobs. One is to motivate a person to play the game, but two is help the person learn the game and prep for game sessions. It seems like it's possible that the two might work against each other. A sparse, to the point presentation of rules and resources help a game master prep for a game and teach players, but the cool fiction and lore descriptions make a person want to run a game in the first place. I mean, is this something that people in the industry consider, or am I just misunderstanding things?
Depends really on the type of game, I think. A lot of other games are a little more rules driven than the storyteller system. The other thing, too, is this is one of the sad parts of the economics of the industry is it's economically better to get all the players and the game master to buy a book as opposed to just the game master. So when you're doing books of it, one of the reasons White Wolf didn't do a lot of book of adventures that game masters could run, scenarios and stuff, is because then only the game masters would buy that book. Whereas a lot of these other books, especially with lore and stuff, everybody could buy them and build up onto the World of Darkness lore, especially the splat books and so on. So yeah, that's one of the realities, the economy of these sort of things. Some
Okay.
other game rules like D&D and stuff. The game master really does need a lot of hard examples, I think, on how to run stuff, and so there's so much work goes into, say, building a dungeon and stuff. So it's a lot easier to just buy a pre-packaged one.
Mhm.
But that wasn't the case with Storyteller. It's all about telling a story together with other players, and it's going to veer wildly. It's not going to be on rails so much as a dungeon is, and so it didn't make as much sense to spend time doing those either.
I can see that. Well, your website says you were lead designer and writer for Mage the Awakening, the later Mage game. Tell us what you accomplished with the fresh take on Mage.
Well, I mean, the whole idea with the World of Darkness when we rebooted it, a huge amount of that was because it was really tough to get new people into the World of Darkness because there was an intimidating what was called the Wall of Marble, referring to when you look at all the vampire books, on a whole shelf, it's just green marble, and there's too many. and there were too many people felt a little intimidated, and the continuity at that point in the world was so. The world of darkness as a whole was just so intricate. It was tough to bring new people into that, and the idea was to start afresh. And Mage was one of those, and the idea being, let's go back to again, the new world of darkness was way less wild, more this world, and darker. And the idea with Mage was to do something a little more traditionally occult. I mean, we had done the technomancers and the mages in the modern world thing, that we pretty much exhausted it with Mage of the Ascension, and we didn't want to just do it all over again. The idea was to have a different angle, and this one was to draw a bit more on traditional occultism, theosophy, things like that.
So, did you see it as a chance to fix the first game's shortcomings, or was it just a great chance to try something new?
Something new. I didn't think it was about the shortcomings at all.
Okay.
Mage was a great game, the Ascension, that is. So I didn't see it as about doing shortcomings. It was just taking a new direction on the whole idea of it. Now, when we first started designing it, for the longest time, we still did keep with the idea of paradigms, and Mage is working on that. But then we made the big break by making it instead of you imposing your beliefs through magic on the world. Instead, the idea being is you have a connection to a higher world, and so you were able to overwrite the laws of this reality using that higher reality. And that changed the game a lot. And part of the problem is we were working so fast that a lot of the Atlantean stuff that was in the game had initially been conceived as a way to give all these different paradigms some sort of common language that they could draw on historically. And we didn't need that once we brought in the new magic system for Awakening, and yet that kind of clung there and became an old thing. It was originally just supposed to be something that one group, the Silver Ladder, was really concerned about, and the rest weren't so much. And I wish we had been able to, slow down enough to just stop, put the brakes on, and restore it to that, where it was really only some people cared about Atlantis, not everybody. Yeah, there it is. I will say part of the inspiration for some of the way magic worked in not the high level metaphysics, but some of the just mechanics rules wise, was a carryover from Dark Ages Mage. Now that was a project that Jess Heineck had initially started, and I finished through, and had some really good rules writing by Stephen Michael DePesa. And so I brought him in to do a lot of the rules writing on Mage the Awakening. And he does a great job with all that kind of stuff. He may not be getting enough of the credit for it, so I want to mention his name, Stephen Michael DePesa. So, if you like Dark Ages Mage and Mage the Awakening, he did a lot of the rule stuff.
Yeah, I'm so glad this podcast was able to interview him in the past. It's great for you to remind us all of the work he did. Well, if I can change gears, I'd like to put two questions to you about Fading Suns. Fading Suns is a far future science fiction game on its fourth edition with Ulysses. I didn't have time to read Fading Suns during my prep for this interview, but I want to hear about it. Is there anything you can tell us?
Yeah, Fading Suns is a far future science fiction game where basically I get to put in all the science fiction stuff I loved growing up as a kid and cram it all into one single universe. The idea is that humanity reached out among the stars, built a high republic of super technology and universal emancipation, then fought over it and lost it. Now they're in the Dark Ages, and an emperor has arisen. Part of it was when we developed the game system, the role-playing game. It was being co-developed with a strategy computer game we did called Emperor of the Fading Suns. And the idea there was that you were a leader of one of the 5 noble houses fighting to become emperor of the known world. And for the tabletop role-playing game, we decided, well, one of these guys won, and we'll do a future history based off that. Although you could still play Emperor of the Fading Suns and bring out a different outcome. We decided that House Hawkwood won, but it could be House Staccatos or the Hazat and the other factions. And the idea being is that it's a Dark Ages in space. You're playing nobles, priests, or merchants, and they're all kind of guilds, sects, and noble houses vying against each other. And there's a lot of weirdness going on too, a lot of strange mysteries. The suns are fading. That gives an apocalyptic sense to all the populations that had spread out. The church, thanks to the overreach of the Second Republic, which then fell, the church controls technology and doesn't want people using too much of it, and hence the only people allowed to sort of use it are nobles and guilders. And so your characters are from those guys. And you're going out and trying to find some of the lost worlds. When the Republic fell, a lot of these worlds were lost, but now you want to try to find them again. And that's because the way you do space travel are these giant jump gates that were left behind by an alien race. And you have to have the right coordinates to go to another jump gate into another system. And part of it is finding those coordinates and then getting to those systems, finding lost worlds. There's all sorts you can do with Fading Suns.
Sounds like fans of Dune who want to focus on more than one planet are going to find a great game there. I want a far future RPG with spaceships. People keep telling me about the different editions of Traveler, but I could never quite get into it. So if I asked you to compare Fading Suns with Traveler, is there anything you can say to that?
Well, Traveler's the classic, sci-fi game, but it's a more hard sci-fi game than Fading Suns, which is a little bit more of a space opera. You can play it with hard sci-fi elements and stuff, but it's really more of an adventure game. I refer to it as Three Musketeers in space. You could look at it as Game of Thrones in space too, because there's a lot of political factions going on. We at the Holistic Design had done a computer game called Machiavelli the Prince, originally called Merchant Prince, where you were basically a Renaissance trader. And that inspired a lot of the way the guilds are done in the Fading Suns game. A lot of the whole Italian Renaissance style of city-states and stuff, but imagining them as planets instead. So it's one of those. I grew up reading a lot of sci-fi, and this is a mishmash of a lot of the ideas and inspirations and stuff pulled from there. For instance, nobles can have energy shields. Well, anybody can have them, but mostly nobles do. Those prevent most bullets and blaster bolts and stuff from hitting you, and hence they duel instead because you can easily slip a sword under. And that's an idea from Dune, but the idea of energy shields themselves isn't from Dune. That was showing up in sci-fi originally. Isaac Asimov's Foundation has them. You go back to E. Doc Smith's Lensman series. They had energy shields there. In fact, that's one of the reasons they had to use space axes, because blasters would just bounce off the energy shields. So, it's just drawing on all these conventions. The idea of noble worlds, nobilities and aristocracies in space, that was throughout a lot of Poul Anderson's work, and H. Beam Piper's Space Viking, and all sorts of that kind of stuff. It just all comes in.
You had me at space opera, but when you mention all those authors, I'm going to have to see if I can get our executive producers to give me an excuse to interview you again, because I'd love to talk science fiction. But for now, I would like to turn the page, and I have 4 questions from listeners. Randane asks, what elements of first edition do you feel were lost that you wanted to carry forward through Mage 20 and beyond? Also, what aspects that have been added to Mage over the years are you most pleased with?
Ooh, wow, that's a good one. I don't know. First edition, the stuff that was lost, I think, again, was kind of lost on purpose. It was to pull back a bit from the zaniness and give it a bit more of a weight to it. The second part, what was added to it? I don't know. I mean, I love that we were able to do a Dark Ages mage, because, Vampire had gotten the Dark Ages, and so did Werewolf. And it took a while, but I was glad Mage finally got to see its own version. Because obviously Sorcerer's Crusade gave us the Renaissance, but going back farther, and the idea of being able to depict it as being very different from those eras too, so that magic worked differently in that era fitted very well with Mage. Magic evolves, it changes as people change. So I guess that would be my answer.
Awesome. Well, TL Webb asks, do you find it more satisfying to pick up and thread the needle of ongoing meta plot, such as Mage Revised, or play with a blank slate setting and develop its history yourself?
Both have their virtues. The plus with Metaplot is, it's like when you're looking at a blank slate on paper and you're like, what am I going to write? And you might pull out story prompt cards and stuff to help you as a writer. And that's what Metaplot helps with and stuff. It gives you a ton of story prompts that you can then run with. And some limitations. Those are always good to work with the limitations. So you already have a pre-done situation, and then how do you work within that? And that's a fun challenge. But it's also good to, start from scratch too. But I think I'd probably lean for the Metaplot because, That's one of the things with the books when you're hiring writers and stuff, and when you're writing yourself, part of the idea is to say, well, how can we take this element and expand on it? And, how can we add a cairn here or for werewolf, or how do we do, chantries over here for this, and so on. So that's what it was all about.
Chris Phillips asks, what were the most significant rewrites coming out of Edition 0 of Mage the Ascension?
Edition 0, I guess you mean Stuart Wick's initial Mage delivery. Most of the rewrites were really just adding the game elements. I mean, the whole philosophy, the metaphysics was there. It was all brilliantly conceived, but there wasn't enough there to actually run a game on. As a player character, you need a magic system, and the magic system that Stuart turned in was really sparse, so that we added that, and the opposition, you might say, the technocracy, that needed a lot more fleshing out, all that stuff, all the things the storyteller then needs to actually run the game, and that the players need enough meat to say, what am I going to play here? Give me some examples. So it was really just fleshing things out more than changing it.
Haylong asks, on Discord, we had an interesting discussion on pseudoscience, its relationship to science and science with a capital S, and the possible weaponization by the technocracy. Since you wrote the most marvelous book on this topic, do you have thoughts on playing subjectivity of what may or may not be pseudoscience in Mage?
Well, I'm assuming what he means is, what's the role of pseudoscience in Mage, I guess, versus actual science? I mean, obviously in the Mage metaphysics, everything's magic, ultimately. All our natural laws that we think of are that way because largely the consensus has made it. Now, in a larger world of darkness sense, when you work with Werewolf a bit, bring in some of that. I'd like to think that some of those rules come from, spirits, in a sense, that have set some of that stuff. But for Mage, it's really about, somebody once upon a time dreamt this up, and this is the way the world works now. So pseudoscience versus science, it's really more a matter then of who gets to write the rules, who gets to say what is what. And obviously the technocracy thinks they're the ones, so they think they set the rules of science. And the whole point of the Etherites is, no, we're going to set the rules of science. So there really isn't a distinction, I think, between pseudoscience and science as such in Mage. It's all just a matter of what can you get people to accept and believe in.
Okay, yeah, I was having a bit of trouble understanding Haylong's question, but I think you framed it nicely. That gives me food for thought. Well, thank you so much for taking time to give this interview. I wanted to thank you personally for the work you did on the game I love. I'm going to include links in the show notes for your website and the current Fading Suns page. Is there anything you'd like to say to the listeners before we conclude?
Thanks a lot for keeping this game going for as long as you have. Thank you very much for being Mage fans.
If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too, and if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. You can follow us on Bluesky, Mastodon, and Threads. The links are in the show notes. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes. We have a YouTube channel now where you can find our episodes. There's a link in the show notes, but you can find us with a search in YouTube, Mage the Podcast. You'll have no trouble. This episode was assisted greatly by our executive producers, and I want to thank them now. Oracle Derek Semsick, Oracle Jason Vines, Oracle Droncap, Oracle Ben Bandelow, Oracle Sean Gallagher, Oracle The Crew of Erebus, Oracle McHale, Oracle Puka G, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Guy Stewart, Oracle Buck Gregory, Archmaster Berto, Archmaster Simon Strand, Archmaster Wolf Larison, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aaron, Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad of the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Maurice Hopkins, Jervis Johnson, George Lara, Will Vincent, Shartan, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Tyler Bryan, Jason Duncan, Sev Nessus, Bubba the Pale One, Henry Kraft, Eric Schwenk, Starfish, Vincent Hamilton, Ambiversion, Ryan Stray, Lulls and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Alexia, Patrick McNamara, Blaze Hebert, Rachel Grace, Daniel Scribner, Ricardo, Rob H., Alex, Nikita Klaimanov, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Anders S., Bryce Perry, Michael Parker, Jeremy Z., Melissa Krause, Ian Robertson, Curtis Hendricks, That's Real Nito, Sig, Manel Canos, Darren Hennessy, Eli Levenger, David Rowe, Jason Kennedy, Samuel Tobin, Nibero, Dennis Osborne, Jenna F., Chris Kinner, Gray Trilug H, Daniel Cuppen, Ryan Kendi, Ia Bull, Stephen Carton. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.